So for the last lecture of our series, it's quite weird to have a lecture at the end of the workshop, but we have experimented it in the last edition. It is a way to say, okay, we have finished it, but we want to open something, to open some topics. What we have discussed during these 2 weeks is not finishing here. On Monday, Politecnico di Milano and this campus, the teaching activity are starting with hundreds of students from different parts of the world, and we are facing some of the topics that tonight Smets, I'm sure, is sharing and is discussing with us. It's always, I mean, quite difficult and also fascinating and challenging to figure out a colleague, an architect, a lecturer for this type of event. So we, together with Sarah, we have selected Bas and asked him to be with us, mainly because of his concept of landscape. To prepare, to have a brief about this lecture, I have listened in some of your conferences, the lecture, Bas, and it was, I guess, fantastic to go through your idea of making landscape as a tool to do something different that is connected with the public space and collective space. You haven't seen our project, maybe we can share in email the next days, the project of the students, but they were asked and called to work about such critical areas among the city of Piacenza and the Po River, so in a sort of buffer zone of infrastructure and so on. And they have strongly worked about the idea of continuity and porosity of spaces. So looking for possibility to join different public and collective spaces to reach a different horizon, we can say, so to create a series, a sequence of spaces. And it's something, I guess, it's a strong part of your work, because as far as I have seen through your project, your main idea is to use and make landscape to create possibility of connection, possibilities of interaction, possibility of moving through parts of the city. It was also interesting your international activity. You have made during the 15, 20 years of activity project in more than 12 countries. Maybe they have, in your website, you mentioned 12 countries, maybe now they are something more. But this idea also to understand that in different countries, in different cities you are working, you are looking for a special identity of the landscape. And this is also as well very important for us, for our culture, and also for the students for sure. Just a few months ago, you have opened a topical project, I guess, is in the Arles, is Parc des Ateliers, well, very important also for the building there and Hungary and so on. You have restored and regenerated in a long process of 10 years a former industrial railway yards. Maybe I think you don't know very well Piacenza, our case study, but here a great part of this buffer zone between the city and the river are industrial areas, are railway yards. So the idea to involve you and to discuss with you, starting from your project, about these topics sound as challenging, important, and interesting. So I give you the floor, Bas. We thank you very much for this lecture that I repeat for us it's an opening of the semester starting on Monday, and it's an important semester because we are maybe exiting from the emergency of the pandemic, and so we can start to discuss about these topics strongly and in presence. So thank you very much, and I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. So I understand I'm at the end of your summer school, so I hope maybe it's good, so at least you can listen to me without trying to understand how it can help you in your project. Maybe it's a good way of just thinking how the coming projects could be inspired. So I'll try to share my screen, see if that works. Let me see. Do you see my screen?
It works, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, as a full screen. Okay, great. Let me see if I can get this down. So I always start with a short introduction about landscape itself. What is a landscape really? Because we all think we know what a landscape is, but I'm not so sure about that. And it's interesting to go back into history, in European history, when landscape was used for the first time as a word. And this is in the 15th century. And landscape is invented as a word not to speak about physical reality, not about to speak about what is there, but to speak about a new genre in painting. So it's really a word invented to speak about paintings. What kind of paintings? Paintings in which windows were cut out of the scenery, showing an outdoors that is organized through perspective. And in this sense, there's a very interesting let's say, inspiration from the early Flemish painters and the Italian painters. The Italians invented perspective, and art history tells us that in the Low Countries, so the southern part of Holland and the northern part of Belgium, these low country painters started to use perspective to organize the elements of the physical outdoors. And here you see a famous painting made by Van Eyck showing the Chancellor Rollin with the Madonna and the child. And you can see that he's really interested in making this landscape a kind of ideal landscape. There's mountains in the back, there's a river flowing, there's a left bank and a right bank, there's a bridge. This is not a place that exists, it's an imagined landscape. And it's also, I think, very inspiring to understand that the first landscapes that were painted were not depicting reality. The painter did not go outside to paint what he saw, but he so landscape as an imagination of how things of reality could be organized through perspective. I think that's a very important notion. So this is the 1500s. This is even 1400s, 15th century. If I jump 100 years later, I'm showing you a painting by Joachim Patinir, another painter from the Low Countries. And here his initial mission was to paint Joseph and Maria on the flight to Egypt. And as you can see, I think we calculated it, it's about 8% of the painting. He was much more interested in playing with atmospheric perspective, going from the ochre to the green to the blue to create depth. He was much more interested in painting rocks, again, water, vegetation. And so in a sense, he inverted this idea of the window, give you a view on a landscape. And he, according to Dürer, he would have been the first landscape painter, really painting landscapes. You have to imagine that in those days, all paintings were about 20 scenes, major scenes, mostly, of course, from the Bible. So he's really inverting the hierarchy between foreground and background. If I go 100 years later, again, this is Peter Paul Rubens, the same mission, if you like, the same commission, the flight to Egypt. And here Rubens is mastering the atmospheric perspective much more than Patinir, as you can see in this very beautiful painting. 100 years later, Claude Lorrain, French painter, is not painting reality, but is painting books from Virgilius. And again, landscape is not what is there, but landscape is what is imagined here in literature, in books. And even when Turner paints the Thames in London, he's much more interested in the effects of the Thames, and you see this mist above the water. And I like to a little introduction with paintings to end with this painting, because it's part of a very important passage in Oscar Wilde's book, The Decay of Lying, in which he says that probably Turner showed us this mist above the Thames, which of course has always been there, but painters and artists more in general have this capacity of showing in a different way. landscape is part of that. He elaborates a theory saying that the land, which is the starting point, the 0 degrees of reality, is transformed into a landscape by an artistic intervention. And it's interesting to note that in most languages, landscape, pays, paysage, in my own Dutch, land, landschap, I imagine in Italian, similarly, there is this, let's say, transformation from land to landscape. From this paintings, I go to two main personalities, I think, that have been very important in understanding landscape in a different way, at least for me. This is Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled to the Americas in the 18th century, and who is probably the first explorer who tries to understand how things work together. So he's looking at his volcano, understanding, and this is like all his measurements. So he takes the height, he takes the temperature, he takes the humidity, he looks at the blueness of the sky, he looks at the vegetation that grows there, and he tries to understand how things are related. And I think it's very important to have this kind of curiousness about how things work. I would call it the logics of nature. And I like the sketches that he has made, where he's really trying to understand the height of the mountains, the way things interrelate one with another. And I think, and I mean, reading about von Humboldt has been extremely inspirational. I all suggest you to read The Invention of Nature, written by Andrea Wolf, which relates his voyages and his adventures and his curiousness and his amazing intellectual capacities to read horizontally through all these fields of knowledge. Second person, he has inspired many explorers after him, almost to understand the planet as one whole, as for example this isothermal chart. He was the first one to really look at the kind of a planetary science, understanding how the globe works. A second person I would like to briefly introduce is Eugene Viola Leduc, mostly known for restoring churches in France. But every year he would go to the Mont Blanc and he would start drawing the Mont Blanc, and he too, more as an architect than as an explorer, would try to understand what the form of the Mont Blanc would be and should be. And he goes really into mathematics and understanding how erosion creates forms, again, trying to understand the underlying logics that produce a physical reality. And he's made this beautiful map of the Mont Blanc, in which he both showed how it should be restored. And I thought it was quite interesting that this famous architect that is known for restoring historical buildings also thought that we should restore mountains to their pristine state and not let erosion do its work as if that was natural. So just like buildings over time get in a worse state because of nature, he thought mountains as well should be restored. So from these two inspirations and from this idea that landscape is really a state of mind and an imagined possible reality based on the existing, we have been working these last, started the office in 2008, so it's been 13 years already. We have been working in many countries. We have built in, I think, 12 or 13 now, but we've always looked at we always try to keep this spirit of the explorer and spirit of an architect of landscape, to understand where we are, understand what would be possible with the project that is given us. And so I will gladly illustrate this with a couple of projects. I will start with our project the closest to Italy, in Albania, just on the other side of the Ionic Sea. We'll go to London, to Paris, and I will end with Arles, which was mentioned in the introduction. So you know what this is. We're just on the other side. This is Corfu, and here is a little beach town called Himara. It's part of Albania on the Ionic Sea. And there was a competition organized by the European community where local officers could team up with international officers to respond to the competition brief. And so we won this competition for this beach town based on a very simple idea, but this idea again that I really understand as imagining a landscape. So the actual situation, you had this kind of seawall, as they call it, a retaining wall for the waves of the Mediterranean, and once in a while this little staircase going down, which resulted to a waterfront disconnected from the Mediterranean, hardly any views. You had cars parked, then you had a kind of odd olive tree, a millstone, even some kind of exotic tree. So from the waterfront, you could not see the water because of this 2 meters high retaining wall, and hardly accessible for a couple of stairs going not towards the water, but away from the water. So we thought it's quite simple. You have to break down that retaining wall. You have to absorb the waves in a number of steps. We spoke to maritime engineers that told us that indeed this would work much better because you don't get the full force against the against one single vertical wall, but you absorb it gradually. Then we looked at the water table to see where we could possibly plant to create a new continuous forest. We were dreaming of a coastal pine forest that when you would be swimming, you would first see the trees and push the buildings to the background. So we won the competition with actually a very simple idea, saying that, okay, we have to implement this new section from one end to the other, which allows us to make a raised plaza on the southern side and a jetty on the northern side. Of course, we made our technical options, but again, always applying this very simple principle of connecting towards the water in a number of steps. So again, here you see the retaining wall, you see the disconnection from the waterfront to the water. This was an image we made during the competition, and this is then the realized project. We planted trees from Italy. We got them from a nursery on the other side of the Ionic Sea, maritime pine trees. And then we made these platforms. We used the same color of sand as the beach itself, as if the beach had been solidified over time to create this new waterfront. We were thinking of the Turkish steppes in Sicily. That was really a very important reference when making this project. And then we made this linear pine forest that creates this foreground and pushes the buildings to the back. On the plazas, we had a number of plane trees, as you can see here. And so all in all, this very, I would say, very straight, clear idea really helped us to refurbish all of the hardscape until the facades of the buildings. And now and so even the roads were made in the same washed concrete, so that you really feel you're on the beach wherever you are. Since we've done this, I must say that the shops and the restaurants and the hotels have really done a big effort to get this upgrade. And now from everywhere you can perfectly see the water, and the water is accessible along this 350 long strip. So I like this picture a lot, where you see that suddenly what before was a parking lot has become a true piece of nature, a mineral coastal pine forest. And when you're swimming, you see first shape, and then the buildings on the hills. From this first project in Albania, we go to London, maybe the smallest project we've ever made, which I like to show because it's really again about seeing possibilities, understanding what landscape can do. This time not based on the setting, but based on climate. So we were asked to make a garden in a sunken courtyard lying at the -1 level in the center of London, only 4 meters wide and 8 meters long, so only 32 square meters, very small, a room by itself. And when visiting the site for the first time, they were renovating the facades, and I thought, well, it was very dark. It was very damp. I was really wondering how I could make a green, lush garden, as my client asked me, in space without any light. And I thought maybe there's a little microclimate because the sun is blocked, but also the wind is blocked. There was a bit of heat loss because of this historically or this building protected by English heritage. And so I asked the construction workers to take a temperature both in the courtyard and on the street, and we saw there was always a 2 to 3 degree difference. So we took the risk, saying that probably it will never freeze in here, even if it freezes outside on the street. And of course, that's a very important threshold in plan choice. So we looked at it more in detail, understanding climatic conditions of the site, understanding that it's very close to the understory of a subtropical forest. Under the big trees of a subtropical forest, you have a whole life of vegetation that hardly sees any light. Of course, here we're lower in temperature, but the conditions were quite similar, so we could plant these exotic tree ferns that come from New Zealand originally, and that thrive perfectly in the shade of a subtropical forest. So it's about choosing the right trees for the right situation, or seen differently, it's about understanding the situation you're working and understanding how it corresponds to a similar situation in nature, bringing that nature to the site. A second question we had was how to make a terrace in this understory. We looked at the sidewalks of Westminster City that were made with York stone. We found a good quarry that in the 18th century had provided these stones to London. We went to see them, and we looked for rocks that we wanted to bring into this garden that we saw more and more as the last piece of London untouched. So we were imagining this landscape as the last piece of London, almost prehistoric, around which the building would have built. We got a big mobile crane, brought the rocks into the garden, brought the trees into the garden. So I climbed up the crane to see these trees flying over London, arriving in the garden. And then we understood that to create this climate that works for these tree ferns, we needed more mist, more dampness. And so every hour we inject 1 minute of mist into the garden. That doesn't go away because there's no wind. And that really creates this prehistoric feeling. With the client, we added this artwork by Franz West that perfectly contrasts with these historical trunks of these ferns. We added a brushed steel wall on the communal wall to expand visually the experience of the garden. And so this was on my first visit when we started to ask to read the temperature, and then this is when we installed the garden. It has grown quite well. You can see Franz West is like sticking out his hand and help. Totally covered by the ferns, and it has become for us a first experience in understanding climate and responding to microclimates that occur everywhere in our cities, because our cities, let's not forget, are artificial environments that we made for ourselves. So they're made up of an enormous amount of artificial microclimates to which we can respond perfectly with landscape, with plants. From this small experience in London, we go to Paris. We go to the La Défense central business district, lying in the axis of the Louvre, as most of you know. This is the Grande Arche. This is the cupola of what they call the Knit. And in between here, there was a urban boulevard driving into the Esplanade. That's this boulevard, you see right here. And a developer found a way of realizing, I think, almost 1,000 micro pillars on which they intended to build a new skyscraper on top of the urban boulevard. And we were asked to make 4,000 square meters of extension of the esplanade, floating above the boulevard and connecting with the level of the city at about 8 meters lower. And so we're asking ourselves, what kind of landscape do you make in such a artificial environment, such a difficult environment, such a complex environment? There's trains running underneath, there's metros running underneath, there's the cars, there's all the foundations. How you make anything that is makes sense for people walking and for people going from these staircases to the esplanade. And so we're thinking that, as I told you, we're always looking at what would be the natural the figure that would correspond with the artificial environment we're working in. And we thought, I was thinking the closest is actually the mountains. And this is the Mont Blanc, Viola Leduc's Mont Blanc, if you like, where of course you have the glaciers or you could say that all these glazed buildings look like glaciers. You have all the rocks of the hardscape. And what's interesting in these mountains, that you always have this tree line, which is the altitude above which no tree can grow. So I was wondering, what's the tree line in La Défense? And maybe we can add a tree line so we give reference to where you are. So from the glaciers and the rocks to the trees and the avalanches, we imagined the trees, but we also imagined the staircases as avalanches as the rocks crumbling down into smaller pieces and landing at the foot of the mountain. So we started to make these schemes where we looked at planting as many trees as possible in a continuous carpet of hardscape, just as in the mountains, and continuing this hardscape along these stairs to really have one single material, only rocks and trees, no other details. And then we made a very sophisticated plan to plant these trees, to irrigate these trees, because we only had 50 centimeters of soil, but we have 50 centimeters of soil on 2,000 square meters. So we had a lot of volume, except we didn't have much depth, as you can see here. And so we worked with a tree nursery in Belgium to prepare those trees to have flat root balls that would expand horizontally and not vertically. We looked at the plan as if it was of all the impossibilities to plant, for example, the beams of the construction. And then we said, okay, in between the beams, we add as much as plant medium as possible. We looked at fire truck access, we looked at the disabled access, and we kind of made a plan of non-plantable zones, either based on construction constraints or passage constraints. And then we planted as many trees as possible, taking these constraints into account. But here again, we read both accessibility for emergency cars or connections of disabled people as natural constraints that allow us to respond to it. So in that sense, we don't make a composition, we follow a logic, and the logic produces its own image. And that I think it's very important, just like in nature. Nature always creates a great image because it follows an internal logic. We try to hack into that logic. We had the obligation to plant 9 trees because that was the result of their studies, their wind studies, but instead we planted 50 trees, again, as many as possible. This was finished this spring. So here you see these stones. There's almost no detailing, or there is so much detailing that you don't see details. As here, you don't see any gutters, you don't see any openings. It's only stone with open joints, perfectly horizontal, and the trees are sticking out. So these stones are not lying on the fertile soil. It's 2 disconnected systems, which allows you to have this continuity of space. And you're really walking in an urban forest. Again, these trees have been planted about 2-3 years ago. In, I would say, 1 or 2 years, we have a continuous canopy blocking the wind and creating a moment of intimacy in this neighborhood with only a high rise. You see the play with these granite slabs, granite or vegetation. There's one single bench allowing you to sit there. And even the staircases, as said before, we've imagined them as a kind of an avalanche of these stones, accompanied by a vegetation. So you're always in between rocks and plants. So again, these have been planted about 2-3 years ago. I'm really looking forward in 2-3 years from now when they've recovered from the transplantation, and they will create this full canopy floating above this urban boulevard. The developer asked us afterwards to also think about the vegetation on the different floors of the skyscraper. And here we continued our thinking. If we were in the valley on the lower side, how would 3,000 meters correspond with 150 meters? And so we looked at different biotopes going from the deciduous trees to the evergreen trees. And so on the top floor, you get a view on Paris framed by these two pine trees. And from Paris, we go south to Arles. So Arles is a Roman city. In the Roman times, it was the second most important city after Rome. There is still an amphitheater, there's still an arena in exceptionally good shape. And next to the small scaled public space of the city center, you have this site created in the 19th century by the French railroad company. They actually dug out of the bedrock to have a totally flat, about 10 hectares big site on which they built industrial buildings to repair locomotives. This activity was stopped in 1985 and has since then been used yearly by the Festival of Photography, Les Rencontres, to show exhibitions in the industrial buildings. So the Luma Foundation, led by Maya Hoffman, bought the private parcels of the sites to make a new venue for not only showing art, but also to produce art. And I was really interested in this idea that a site where before locomotives were made, now art is made. So how can we keep the kind of abstract situation next to the city where a different world or a different way of imagining a site is possible? And so when I started working on this, we looked at the site. The site is, as I said, basically curved out of the bedrock. We could not dig. Part of it was also lying on a Roman necropole. We could not dig for archaeological reasons at most in most of the site. So there was this sterile site, and even 40 years after the factory had been closed, there was no trees, there was no vegetation because there was no earth and there was no water. But then when we looked at the site, which is lying right here in the middle, on a larger scale, we understood there was 3 amazing bioregions, very different ecological regions lying around the site. The Alpi, which is a southern branch of the Alps, so a very mineral condition. There was a Caux, which was a former riverbed of a glacier, where no trees could grow because there was a waterproof layer of clay underneath. And then there's the Camargue, which is the estuary plain of the Rhône. So very different regions that we really looked at in detail again to understand how plants work with those very different conditions, from the rocks where trees grow in the cracks to the water of the Camargue where you get a very different type of vegetation that plays with the abundance of water, to where trees could grow. Can we not imagine the site lying in between those three geomorphological landscapes as a test ground for what nature would have done? So we said it is connected with this existing loop of trees to the city center. Let's imagine what would have happened over 200 years, even 300 years if necessary, if we would not, if humans would not intervene. And so we started exploring the site, understanding the limit of the archaeology, which is right here, looking at, again, fire truck access, but also at services. And then we started looking at both the wind and the sun, imagining how nature would come back. And there is this Mistral wind. It's a very strong northern wind, up to 180 kilometers per hour winds that can last for days in a row, 7 days, for example. And so we started modeling these winds. We had the studies from the Frank Gehry building, which is the most important or the new element on the site. All the buildings have been renovated by Annabel Zeldorf, but so the Gehry building is really let's say the new attraction to the site. So from this wind study, we imagined a new topography, and we imagined that the wind over time would bring sediments, because this wind comes from the glaciers in Switzerland, follows the Rhone and hits the site. And so we imagined that once we have this new topography, we have a new system of micro situations. We imagined even that the wind would carve out a lake, make this kind of dune landscape. And then we looked at the situations based on orientation, based on proximity to the water, based on height of the new hills. And we imagined a whole new biotope, which we then planted with 80,000 plants, 650 trees, 500 shrubs, and 80,000 smaller plants, based on this principle that the wind creates a dune, and this dune is then in summer protected from the sun by the trees, while in winter it's protected from the wind by the earth and its vegetation. So it was really a study in how nature would come back, and of course, what was interesting is that if you think that the topography is made by the wind, the more you have depth, the more you advance in time. So in a sense, when you walk in space, you walk through time. And so the first plants would come in shallow earth. So these would be pioneer plants, pioneer species. The more you advance, the more you go further in time. And end with the climax species, the kind of end stage of the ecological succession, which would be for this region the pine tree. And so you go through all the layers of vegetation that would have happened before, for example, after a fire around or in this region, but we planted them all at the same time, all with different heights. So the earth is made by the wind. The water comes from a nearby canal, a canal that was dug out 500 years ago to irrigate the Caux, and which passes by the side before dumping the excess water into the Rhone. So we spoke to the association saying that, well, since this water is not used by the farmers, can we not pump it into our lake, filter it, and then use it for irrigation? And this was agreed by them. So this is an image we had made a couple of years ago. I'm showing this because we were really looking for a new type of park where, let's say, wilder zones go into grassy zones, go into water, where really humans are invited to access this new natural park, but it's not a public park waiting for visitors. It's a park that's almost an independent organism that allows you to visit it. That was a very important nuance where we thought it needs to be its own reason of existence. This is also an image that we made, the Gary Tower, the renovated buildings, and then this landscape that really connects all of this and gives you a feeling of belonging when you're there. So a lot of work was done on the sections. Since we couldn't dig, we were looking at how to remake a section that can support life. We had to rethink how to store water, how to infiltrate water, how to allow these trees to grow on a site without digging into the ground. So it was really an important study in understanding how life can be brought back to a site. We looked at quarries around the site for these blocks that you've seen in the section. And so on site, again, we don't dig. We make a hydric reserve. We made a kind of little artificial aquifer, if you like, a water holding layer. No rainwater is taken off the site. Everything is kept on the site, and through capillarity goes back to the trees, leaves, lowers the temperature. Now we build up these hills based on the wind study. We brought in big trees. We started with big trees, then middle trees, then smaller trees, and then the smallest ones. Again, as I told you, 80,000 plants. And in the beginning, it was tough because we were planting in a semi-desert condition. But more we planted, more the conditions changed. And today, it's a Mediterranean climate. So we dropped the temperature with 8 degrees. Here you see a picture taken this summer. But we changed the perceived temperature, which is made up of temperature, humidity, wind speed, radiation. We drop it with 20 to 25 degrees. So where before on the platform through radiation, you would have a perceived temperature of 40 to 45 degrees. Today it's 20 to 25 degrees. So it has become a usable space. And again, you see all this paths again based on wind and orientation. You see all our plants, they will grow, the water, the fish have gone back, the frogs have gone back, the birds have gone back, and we are now with a scientific research center, we're checking over time the life that is being established in the soil, in the air, and in the water. So here you see basically the lawns that we've made are an exception to the ecological succession and are green carpets for humans, so they can also use the park. This was opened beginning of July. It was for us a very complex project to really change the climate from this semi-desert climate to this Mediterranean climate. And so with this picture, I'd like to end this presentation. Here you see how we to at the same time connect with the landscapes lying around the site and creating new atmospheres for both people and animal life and plant life to recolonize the site. And maybe in the concluding words, I think more and more landscape architecture, and I'm going back to the 15th century, has to be understood as a way of organizing reality. And since we are living, and especially you students, you will be confronted with climate change, with extreme weather. This landscape is not just ornamental, it is a way of keeping our cities livable. It's a way of creating resilience. It's a way of storing rainwater, using trees to lower temperature. I think landscape will be extremely necessary to adapt all our cities and make them resilient for all the changes to come in the next years. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bas, for sharing this project. I think it's fantastic also because Arles can be seen and also in this aerial view as one of the very exemplary condition of European middle cities. And it's very close to Piacenza condition because there is a river, there is an historical city center, there are a lot of disused and former industrial areas. And today Arles, because of this project in Luma Foundation, has become one of the iconic iconic city and town of European contemporary architecture and landscape for sure. And so it's very interesting for us to discuss about it and to try to understand better the condition. I'm opening for sure the discussion with colleagues and students also at home. I would like opening it with my questions. It's about the time. I remember I visited one of the rencontre photography you were mentioning maybe 20 years ago. And I was in one, maybe it was one of the first year, this industrial building were used to show the photographic exhibition. It was, I mean, like a no man's land. I know maybe the first project were in progress. And I would like to know better, if you can, one point about how the society has got this bringing back the nature within the area. Because I guess the building site was long. How the people living there started to know about the project, transformation on the project. So also the time, because the bringing back of something in an area to renovate, to regenerate, and so on. But there is also a period of maybe 10 years in this case, or maybe longer, where the area is something in the middle. And it's interesting to understand how people can be aware and conscious of this situation.
What was peculiar here is that, of course, there was a lot of attention to the Tower of Frank Gehry, which allowed us to kind of work in the shade of the tower, which is a very nice condition. So since the whole side is walled off, nobody really knew what was going on beyond the tower. Nobody was allowed into the site, and during the rencontre, only parts were open, the rest were in construction, and we did not send out any images of the construction to keep it as a kind of a big surprise. And I remember end of June, we first started to do private tours with all the people from Arles before opening it up to the public. We would go with all the hotel owners, the restaurant owners along the side, and walking down the ramp right here, would come down, and it was just like this kind of disbelief almost, like it's such an abrupt change. It's such a radical change that it seems hardly believable. And then the funny thing is that once it's there as if it has always been there. And now they're doing yoga classes at 8 in the morning, Tai Chi classes at 5 in the afternoon. There's kids playing football, and in a sense, since we really use the logic of nature, it seems like it's this kind of double amazement from is this really possible, and then how could it have been different, and that I think was really interesting to kind of compress this time. So there was no the construction side, and of course COVID in that sense helped, because I mean there was much less visits anyway, but it was really from 0 to 1 for most of the people that had been there before and then had been there afterwards and not during.
It was like a landscape by, I mean, not in a long time, but it's an unexpected situation. This is, well, amazing and fascinating as an experience, I guess.
Yeah, and we went really very far in this idea of what nature would have done. But for us, it became a kind of research project, and we thought, okay, if we can change the climate here, we can change it in many other situations. Because this is a rough climate with the mistral wind. In summer, it gets to 20 days in a row. It's hot. It's windy. So we really and we also noted everything we did to say, okay, maybe it can become a methodology that can be applied on other sites as well. So in that sense, we were aware of the kind of we were really trying to make something exemplary, really based on this hypothesis of what nature would have done.
But I'm giving you, well, I remember all the student colleagues, you can write your question in the chat, otherwise you can give directly. We received in chat one question by Remy Sichping. He's from UN Habitat. He's the chief of the unit in policy, legislation, and governance for UN Habitat, so the international agency working for better urban cities. And he's asking you, okay, an idea of the cost of the project. Again, we are not interested to say how many euros it costs, but it's interesting to understand how also this part of the project, so the landscape intervention in terms of remediation and regeneration of the soil, impact on such important development project.
Yeah, the cost is hard to say because there's so many different aspects to it, and partly it's paid by the public, partly it's paid by private. But I can tell you, compared to other parks we made, it is more expensive, yes, but not twice as much. You know, it is affordable. It's not of course it's not easily. You cannot copy it to another site because here we had free water, which makes a big difference thanks to this canal made 500 years ago. So we also had earth because we dug out a lake. I used all the foundations of the Gary building to make the hills. So we were very smart about our resources, and we tried not to import too much other materials. So in a sense, I mean, I would say it's totally feasible on other sides, but again, you always have to work with the existing to make sure that you use the resources that are there, and that we did to the fullest here, really almost being in a zero ground balance.
Okay, thank you. So about this point, I guess I ask all the audience to give many questions or comments about the topics Bas has shared with us this night. Is it somebody? Bye.
Yeah, we are in the same room.
Bye, Padre. Sorry. Sarah. Okay.
Sorry, it's very difficult because we are all in the same room and the audio and the technical stuff is always problematic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's much clearer. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, really, I think your lecture was super interesting, and from the landscape point of view, also we deal with that in our studio here in Piacenza, and I think was very inspiring. Also, like the graphical representation of your ideas and so on. I was wondering, you kept referring to in your lecture about this kind of nostalgia to the past, like the prehistoric age, almost also in some projects and so on. And nature as a tool that can solve also some of our nowadays issues like climate change and such. And I was wondering, like in the technological age that we live in, like also as COVID exasperates somehow this huge presence of technologies in our life. Do you think landscape will be influenced by it? Like also in the way we design it and we use it as a tool, as a performative landscape also in some cases, or you think it will ultimately escape these logics and just exist as its own?
No, it's a very good question. I think we will absolutely need technology to make new types of landscape. And for example, and so nostalgia, it's not I wouldn't think of our project as nostalgic. For example, the project in Paris, without sensors to understand the humidity in the soil, I could not plant those trees in 50 centimeters. Arles, there's plenty of sensors as well. So I get bulletins to give those trees. So these new situations kind of, or let's say technology allows us to make these projects that we would not have been able to make 10 years ago. And even the London project, this misting system is also based on technology that captures the humidity. So in a sense, we do use technology to bring nature where it could have not gone by itself. So I don't think in the man-made environments that nature can escape this, because we've just made our cities too artificial for nature to easily reconquer it. So I think And used in a smart way, it works. And I think that's the good news. We can really have a more intelligent irrigation, a better knowledge of where the roots are, a better knowledge of what trees and plants need. And I think in a more and more artificial world, because that's what's happening with humans, we will need that technology to allow nature to find its place again. So it's never going back to what was there, but making a new landscape capable of the future. And the future is not bright, the future is hot. So we have to be smart about what we plant, how we plant it, how we find water for it, and making sure that everything we plant today will still be alive in 20 years when we're 2-3 degrees warmer.
Thank you so much for your input. Yeah, I think we also have a question here from our.
Sorry.
Yes, I really thank you because of your very inspiring lecture. Also, a lot of students are writing this. I have a question which is very related to the last topic. Basically, I'm very often embarrassed about a sentence that it is very often used also once we look at the European community research, which is the sentence nature-based solutions. And then the result it is that normally you see diagrams with icons, with goals, and with goals that are not dealing with the question of what are the means. I would like you to tell us what do you think about this, because I have the feeling that very often landscape architecture is neglected because it is not completely understood what you have showed very clearly, that at the end you have really to have knowledge, technical and scientific knowledge, and you have to be able to handle processes. And it's not nature-based solution, it is just current solutions within a field which has clearly some tools. And so my question is a little bit, how do you relate with this approach, which is very often, it's very used everywhere, but it is sometimes, according to me, producing kind of schematic and not really efficient approaches to the question of bringing back nature to the city.
No, also a very good remark, because the thing is, we deal with living organisms. If what we imagine doesn't work, it'll show. If everything dies, it's a failure. And so in that sense, we need to be very precise, very technical about the earth we bring, about the water we bring, about the trees we plant. And we totally with you that landscape is still seen as a kind of 19th century embellishment of a city. It's not decoration. I mean, it's totally essential. The air you're breathing is made by a plant. It wasn't there. And I think people and politicians are finally getting that. And this summer was another reminder with all the fires in the south and all the inundations in the north. I mean, and this will happen again and again. So we should not be alarmist, but we should be totally honest and transparent about it. We need landscape architecture. We need new landscapes to keep our cities livable from an inundation or a point of view, flooding point of view, and a heat point of view. And it'll hit us again and again. And so we need to transform our cities now, tomorrow.
Okay, thank Bas. Any other comments? Truly inspiring. One of the students by the workshop comment you. Okay. Otherwise, I mean, one of the points that you were discussing now, Bas, with Sarah, is about also the time, not just the time of building, but from now to tomorrow. And it should be interesting to understand how can you imagine this area of, we can take Arles as an example, in 20 or 30 years. I mean, is your landscape design can become a factor also of transformation of the area all around? How can can interact the new design you have done with, for example, the industrial heritage buildings that when maybe during next 20 or 30 or 40 years they are changing identity and vocation. Do you think at the end that the landscape your landscape design is also able to address future transformation in the surrounding?
But what's different between landscape and architecture is that landscape is really accessible to all, and so you see, and I'm very happy to see that people are doing these yoga classes. I mean, that's not organized by the Luma Foundation. It's not organized by the city. It's just citizens saying that, oh, we have this park, let's use it, and let's do different activities. And in that sense, the park is already changing the habits of the citizens of Arles and its visitors, and so it will only grow and only become more present. And in that sense, I've always seen it as a autonomous organism that allows birds to nest, that allow people to walk, that allow fish to swim and frogs to walk about. And so in that sense, the how to say it, is this landscape will only grow bigger, stronger coming years, and the users can change. It's not made for users, it allows users. And I think, and maybe it's a big difference between architecture and landscape architecture, is that we don't build public space for a singular use. We always make space that allows users, and that can be different 20 years from now than what it's made for tomorrow. And yeah, and in English they say that there's a big difference between to make and to make do, or in French they say faire avec. And to like if you make an object, you make an object. In landscape architecture, you always make do, like a doctor, you know, you work with your patient and your patient is the site. And so in that sense, we're looking for the vocation of a site. What can it become? What would be its best possible reality? And that then allows people and other living organisms to use it. But I think this balance of landscape architecture is very important in that sense.
I thank Bas. I can see raised hand by Antonella, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture. My question is about COVID. The COVID allow us to discuss a lot about how will change our way to live our houses and also our public spaces. My personal opinion is that probably the domesticity will be much more related to the house. Instead, our desire to live in common and with the other person will be much more related to public spaces. How do you think that a landscape project could become the driver for another idea of to stay in common? Sometimes we see in a lot of projects, also quite relevant, the representation of the public space and the park. It's quite astonishing regarding how people use. No, I used to say, or you have a boyfriend, or you are very healthy and you run, or you have a children. But it seems that the project right now didn't comprehend the fact that the complexity of the people that right now live in the metropolis, that are elder, migrant, refugee, poor, rich, etc. How do you think that a landscape project could help us to define a city for everybody, speaking about a real common and public space? The problem is about what is common, what is private, what is public. And the last question is, since speaking about a landscape project, we use to speak about sustainability, climate change, public spaces, etc. How do you think that we can use the Sustainable Development Goals that, as a matter of fact, our state signed, and right now for us seems so far away from an idea, operative idea, or SDGs as a tool, a real operative tool for our project? Thank you.
So I do think COVID has changed our relationship to public space and parks. And I think in two ways. When we were confined, we understood that the tree that was next to our window is super important, whether it was there or not there, and not the park 500 meters away. So suddenly this kind of presence of nature close to where you were confined became so much more important, because you could yourself not move anymore when you were not allowed to leave your house. So this kind of physical presence of landscape to where you are became very acute, which before it wasn't, because you could move yourself. I think that's one thing. A second thing is that I mean, I've been living between Brussels and Paris, and they both had a very different way of dealing with COVID. So in Paris, all the parks were closed, while in Brussels, parks were open for the public. And what we've seen in Brussels is that the park became the new public space. And for example, when I would meet friends, I mean, since all the bars and the restaurants were closed, we would do the tour of the lake, grab a coffee, and it has become a new habit that we haven't changed. Like we still meet walking in the park, and we have understood that walking in the park creates a whole different discussion than sitting down and having lunch, for example. So I think more and more public space will become again a way where people meet. And so in the design, we try not to design it for one use, not for one type of users, and not for one vision of what public space or a park could be. You try to, and that's where again nature is so inspirational. You try to make a piece that uses logic of natures and produces an image that then can be used by different groups of people, by 1 person, 10 persons, different races, different ages. And so in that sense, we try not to look at the history of parks, but we try to look at nature itself as an inspiration. Because when you walk in the Alps, whether you're old or you're young, or you're brown or you're white, or you're a male or a female, it is there, and it's for you to use the way you think you should use it. So in that sense, that we try not to reference the public spaces or the parks we made, but we try to go further than that. So to again create something that's open and that allows you to respond to it the way you like to respond to it. So I think that's very important. And in that sense, I like to make projects where people are a bit like, whoa, what is this thing? Like, how should we use it? Is it, for example, all the paths in Arle, it's a bit confusing because there's not one path that brings you, but you have to choose yourself where you go. And so it creates a new way of engaging with the public space. So I hope I respond to your question with this.
Ronella, are you satisfied?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I think that is an important shift. Probably we need to introduce also other elements that were related to the public space as a space where we act as a society and not only as in singular individual. So I really would like to think that public space could follow the idea of Hannah Arendt and that was as an ancient idea of the Greek space, where the landscape embraces the entire population of a city as a reference of their community, of to stay together. And right now, until now, for me, there is a sort of lack of not only of a morphological invention, but also functional invention. because it seems that it's only a place for health or for yes, a meeting point. I agree, but is it possible to replace the idea of public spaces that we had, in particular in our Western country, with a park? For me, is a question mark.
But in that sense, for example, in Arles, they had specifically asked me to make a place where you could organize concerts, where you could organize public art, where you could, I mean, if I was adding all the different programs they asked of me, I could have not planted one tree and everything needed to be flat and concrete. And so, for example, this, I don't know if you still see my screen, but this big lawn is made as a reinforced grass layer, reinforced like a soccer field or football field would be. And this, no, next weekend, they're organizing the first concert. So there will be a big podium here, it will be 3,000 people. And so we'll test for the first time how this landscape allows these kind of activities to happen. And in that sense, I'm happy. It's a landscape that allows concerts. It allows exhibitions where more than, I don't know how many thousands of people come to the hall. So in that sense, it's not a park, 19th century park where you walk your dog and you sit on a bench to read your newspaper as a kind of cliche. But it's a park that is it's an event space. It's an exhibition space. It's an experiment in ecological succession. And so I like your question a lot. I think our public spaces should be rethought as pieces of landscape, because we need to store the rainwater on site, and we need trees to bring water back into the atmosphere to cool down the temperature. So in that sense, all public space should be rethought to make it more resilient.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bas. I guess these words are a fantastic way to close not just your lecture. That was you can read also the comments. It was very, very appreciated by all our students. But it's a fantastic way also to close our workshop we did in the last 2 weeks. And so, as I was saying, opening this session also, the fantastic way to open the semester. We are starting here at Politecnico di Milano from next Monday. So we want all together, Sarah.
Say hello to everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, and so we thank you, and we thank you all. So, okay, it's also a quite moving moment because we are closing this experience. And so we thank all the students, first of all the colleagues, Karim, Lina, Juan Carlos, all the colleagues who working on the workshop and collaborating with us in this amazing project for Piacenza post-COVID. And for sure, you pass as a key lecturer of our final day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.